You will fulfill the law of Christ. You will fulfill the law of Christ. Kevin read it with some power. Kevin can crank up the intimidation when he reads scripture, I've noticed. He's very talented. You will fulfill the law of Christ. That is an intimidating phrase, I think. We have a hard enough time following rules that come from petty authorities, let alone the law of the one who sits at the right hand of God. My first job was at an ice cream parlor. There was a list of rules taped to the freezer. The customers couldn't see this list, but every single time you scooped a scoop of ice cream, you could see it. And ersatz 10 commandments written on a receipt in blue ink. Smile at every customer, rinse the scoop between flavors. Don't try to put 8 ounces of ice cream in a 6-ounce dish. No stealing. Eating ice cream is stealing. Don't talk to your friends. That one always struck me as the most outrageous. I was 14, I was eager for a paycheck. Welcome to capitalism. Don't talk to your friends. I talked to my friends. Most of the time, rules are better at predicting your missteps than elevating your behaviors. Here are all the ways you're gonna mess this job up. I only liked one thing about that job. I didn't like the smell of ice cream or the rude intensity with which people tend to order it. I didn't like busy shifts because they made my arm hurt. I didn't like slow shifts because Mr. Papadogiannis, the owner of the ice cream parlor, made me take a butter knife and pry loose change out of the gaps between the floorboards. On one rainy afternoon, I spent 3 hours at this task and I gathered 53 cents. He kept every penny. The next day, when he wasn't looking, I ate half a gallon of mint chip in 10 minutes. After that, I didn't like ice cream. The only thing I liked about this job was pouring out milkshakes. We used those old school blenders with a steel cup. The steel cup held 2 or 3 more ounces than the fancy fluted glass the milkshake was poured into. So after making a shake, you would set the empty fluted glass on a deep saucer and you would pour the milkshake in, and it filled the glass and then ran over the sides, a superabundance of dessert that the glass could not hope to hold. I didn't have to fake a smile when I served a milkshake. As Mr. Papadogiannis said, the eyes eat first. You will fulfill the law of Christ. That's what Paul says. The Greek word that gets translated as fulfill means to fill up, to overflow. One biblical commentator says the word fulfill in this reading means to satisfy completely, as with good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. You will overflow the requirements of the law of Christ. You will satisfy it completely. That's not a command, it's a promise. How? By bearing each other's burdens. Not by paying close attention to every jot and tittle of a rule book, but by bearing each other's burdens. Listen closely. Paul is being deeply ironic with this phrase. The law of Christ is a code, not a commandment. The law of Christ is a life principle, not a list of rules. The law of Christ is the life principle of all who follow Jesus by taking up his cross of creative suffering. The law of Christ is the life principle of all who follow Jesus by taking up his cross of creative suffering. The question isn't if you'll suffer, right? The question isn't if we'll suffer. I saw a friend of mine who's a professor at a divinity school over the 4th of July. He just got done teaching a 12-week class that met twice a week called Suffering. The wild thing is that he said so many students signed up for it, he had to turn it into a lecture course. He'd been writing 2 lectures a week on suffering. Let me tell you, that's not the person you necessarily want to spend a hot afternoon with after they've had a couple of beers. Suffering. And what he told me is that the young people in the class all wanted to press God with the question, why? Why suffering? But the older people in the class, they just knew, you suffer, we suffer. So to fulfill the law of Christ is to take your suffering and to use it creatively, to use it generatively, to make life out of it. And how do you do that? How do you make life out of suffering? By bearing each other's burdens. You don't fulfill the law of Christ by trying to become perfect. Martin Luther said, trying to be perfect is trying to win an argument with the devil on the devil's terms. You fulfill the law of Christ by being human, by being the creature God made you to be. That's all you have to do. Be human. Doesn't sound like a stretch, right? You could have accomplished this without getting out of bed this morning. You wake up, look at yourself. Did I become a cockroach overnight? No, good, done, mission accomplished. I'm going to sleep till 1 and then watch TV. Look at me, fulfill the law of Christ. It's a low bar. You can't stop being a Homo sapien. But you can be inhuman. That is a richly theological word that doesn't show up in Scripture. Inhuman. We can be inhuman. You saw the photograph of Oscar Ramirez and his baby daughter Valeria dead on a riverbank, face down in the mud. You saw it. Oscar carried Valeria across the river. Then he went back for his wife. The toddler got scared and she waded into the water to be toward her parents, and the current grew strong, and Oscar heard her cry and he turned and swam for her, and he hadn't eaten in days. We can be inhuman. We've all heard about the camps on America's southern border. Children locked up and left to fend for themselves. We can be inhuman. Oh God, stop talking about it. Stop being political. Turn the TV off. Look at the stained glass. Light a sparkler. Watch the fireworks. Look away. There's a storm out there. Yes, we all know it, but it's calm in here. Close the windows. I tell myself those things almost every week, and I've been telling myself those things and following those rules of decorum, well, for the past 2.5 years at least. We can close the windows, of course, and when we do, gradually, any trace of Christ that is inside this place, which tends to come blowing through the windows, any trace of Christ that is inside this place will grow thin, non-existent, until eventually our church resembles a house with a faulty carbon monoxide alarm more than it does a church. Jesus doesn't look away. Jesus doesn't glance at the New York Times and cringe and shove it to the side. Jesus doesn't switch as fast as he can from the news to Amazon. Jesus sees Oscar and Valeria. He sees all the crowds of migrants, tens of thousands of parents and children fleeing violence and hunger, cartels and corruption. Jesus sees them, and in seeing them, Jesus shows us what it is to be human. He's not being divine when he sees them. He's being the creature God made him to be, human. We can't walk on water, but we can see each other. Jesus sees people. That sounds kind of obvious, right? You've seen some people today, but it's actually rare. Because more often than not, when we look at another person, what we see is a blank screen that we project our own assumptions onto, our own needs onto. Oftentimes what we see when we see another person is an object that we can use. But Jesus sees you for who you are. He sees you for who you are. If you let him, you have to let him. Karl Barth says that this is the first hallmark of being a human. We see each other and we let ourselves be seen. It isn't breathing, it isn't automatic. We can be inhuman, isolated, removed, artificial. Or we can let other people see who we really are, what we really need, what we really fear, how we really hope. Because it's only when we stop seeing others and stop letting ourselves be seen, it is only then that we can muster up the inhumanity to lock migrant children in cages. If all you do, though, is see the other person and let yourself be seen, take your guard down and look into who they really are, if that's all that you do, if all you do is see other people's needs, pain, promise, strength, that's all you do. You don't let yourself be seen. All you do is pour yourself out. I see you. If that's all you do, and you don't let yourself be seen, you risk becoming a burnt-out, self-medicating, left-leaning, self-righteous, self-congratulatory Twitter account, right? Or you risk becoming a burnt-out, self-medicating, left-leaning, self-righteous, self-congratulatory preacher. Inhuman in either case. You have to take time to see the person that you're with, and you have to let yourself be seen. You have to take your armor off. You have to set your resume and your accomplishments and your pride, all of it, you have to set it to the side. Jesus let himself be seen. Father, take this cup from me. I thirst. Yes, you can wash my feet. None of those things are miraculous. He's just being human. Jesus let himself be heard. That's the next thing. To be human, you have to hear other people. And listening is hard, right? Listening takes work. Actually, listening takes questions. Is that what you really mean? Am I hearing you correctly? When you said you thirst, I got the sense that you want some water. Is that right? We're trained how to do that in seminary, right? You tell me something, I rephrase it, this long exercise in synonyms. You have to have a whole class in graduate school to teach you how to listen to another person. Listening is hard. To be human, you have to care about what the other person is saying to you. And you have to speak words that are worth hearing. Words that are true and urgent. Words like these, you might remember them. I repeated them. I'm repeating myself now. But I can't forget this. I think I'll probably go another 15 years and not hear words this human. My son's friend, O.C., 10-year-old kid, he lives across the street from the Lincoln Park Zoo. And I asked him, O.C., what do you think about living across the street from the zoo? Is that a good place to live? And he said, it smells. Right? True words. It smells. And then he spoke some urgent words. Everybody says those animals are so well cared for. Well, I got one question. Where are their families at? Where are their families? You have to speak words that are worth listening to. You have to hear what another person is saying. But seeing and hearing are not enough to qualify us as truly human. We also have to act, right? We have to act. Part of the reason I can't forget those words is because they call me into some kind of action. I haven't figured out what it is yet, but I know that there is a call for action there. You can't just listen to people who suffer and long and hope for healing. You have to do something. You have to get in their lives and act on their behalf, right? It starts at home. It starts at church. What does Paul say? Do good, he said in that reading we just heard. Do good for everyone, particularly those in the household of faith. Why does he say start at home, start at church? Because it's the easiest? Maybe not. Maybe because it's the hardest. Maybe because we know there's forgiveness in both of those environments and we can make mistakes. Maybe because this place is something of a gymnasium teaching us how to be human so that when we step outside this world, we're ready to be human. So you have to act. You can't just say, I love my children. You gotta spend 8 Saturdays in a row watching 5 youth basketball games in Waukegan. You have to act to be human. And you have to let yourself be helped. We are more than strength. We are more than strength. We are more than latent strength that is afraid to exercise itself and doesn't really want to help. We are more than strength to refuse your weakness, to ignore the fact that you need friends to help you be a mother or a husband or an adolescent or a widow or a Christian, is to refuse to be human. Here's something interesting I've learned from seeing my mother-in-law, Kelly's mother, Delcy, suffer for years with late-stage dementia. Anyone, I said this at Kathy Castle's funeral last week, anyone who's ever loved somebody with Alzheimer's or a similar disease understands that while those with the disease might forget almost everything else, they know that they need to be loved, to be helped, to be seen, to be held. And that knowledge sits at the heart of what it is to be a human being, knowing that you need to be helped, held, loved. To fulfill the law of Christ, you have to acknowledge the fact that you are more than strength, just as God is much more than omnipotence. One last thought from Karl Barth. Well, not for all time, just for today. It's possible, of course, to go through your whole life, seeing others and letting yourself be seen, and doing so indifferently. Hearing others and speaking true words and doing so coldly. Even acting for others rudely. We all know social justice types who love humanity but can't seem to stand individual people. So you can do everything that I've named and still be inhuman. I know that because I've done it. The mark of a truly human person is that she does these things and it brings her gladness. It brings her gladness. It brings her a reward that nothing else in life can bring, to be human. Don Camp, who's a member of St. Paul's, many of you know Don. He worked for years at Children's Memorial Hospital as a chaplain when it was just right across the street. He told me that he had to, back in those days, minister to families of gunshot victims with awful frequency. And he told me that he'd seen a pattern develop over the years, that when a bereft mother learns her son has been shot to death, imagine seeing this so many times you can spot the pattern. When this happens, she will collapse onto the floor, roll around down on the ground moaning. Don told me this over lunch. How do I get in these conversations? There we are, sitting there having lunch together. He started to tell me this story. He told it to me because earlier in the conversation, I'd told him that on the few occasions that I had to break the heartbreaking news of a death to parents, on the few occasions that I've had to do that, I willed myself still. I willed myself still removed. Because I said, you cannot grieve like a keening parent while you're ministering to grieving parents. I took myself out of the picture, all clinical. Don was gentle, but he corrected me beautifully. He said that over the years, he learned to get down on the floor with the grief-struck mothers, to get down on the floor. He didn't moan or roll around. He just lay near them while they cried on the floor in the grime of an ER vestibule. That doesn't make him happy. It didn't make him happy. But I know that Don is glad in his work. Glad because it calls on his humanity. Because every time he poured himself out and onto the floor, every time he planted a seed in the Spirit, every time he let himself spill over the rules of decorum and even safety, right over the edge of the glass down onto the saucer, every time he fulfilled the law of Christ. There is no neutrality between us. The world wants us to be hostile to one another, right? All day long, you're called to be hostile to groups and people you haven't even met, to other people in their cars, to that guy on a bicycle when I'm driving who has the temerity to run through a stop sign, hostile to that driver who looks angry when I ride my bike right through a stop sign, hostile. But we're not even neutral with each other. We're not made to be neutral. There is no neutrality between us. We are connected with each other. That's what God makes. That is who God makes. Not an individual oak tree planted strong by itself, but an entire forest of oak trees, roots deep down into the ground, lit up by the same sun, fed by the same water. We are human beings, but we can only be human together. Amen.